Just because you're getting a separation and divorce does not mean necessarily that you have to hate each other forever. In fact, well, maybe hate each other right now, but what if you were able to engage in a process that reduced the likelihood of you having an amicable separation and moving forward in a way that, well, saves you money, time, resources, stress? Well, what I'm about to share with you is the collaborative law process. And what is that? Well, it's a very specific way of resolving your family law matter. And it is when you enter into a collaborative law agreement. That agreement says, well, you and your spouse and your lawyers, who have to be specifically trained in the collaborative law process to qualify, you're going to sit down, you're going to roll up your sleeves, and you are going to hammer out the elements of a separation agreement, and you're not going to go to court. In fact, if the collaborative process doesn't work once you've entered into it and, well, someone has to go to court, guess what they have to do? They have to dismiss the lawyer that they've had throughout the process and go get a brand new lawyer and start all over again. The point being is once you are in the collaborative law process, well, you can't leave it very easily. Collaborative law works well for honest people who want to save their precious resources by getting to an agreement quickly and on a very amicable basis. So, is collaborative family law for you and your changing families? Well, let me share with you some of its potential benefits. Now, you're going to want to stick around to the end of this recording because, well, like all things human, although I'm about to share 10 potential benefits, there are some downfalls of collaborative law. And before you engage in the collaborative law process, I want you to be aware of what those downfalls are as well. So, diving into the potential benefits, here's something that's really great. Well, especially compared to litigation. The thing is that your business, your family business, the intimate details of your life, the intimate details of your relationship, it stays private. That is, it stays private between you and your spouse and your lawyers. Or maybe there's another collaborative family law professional that gets involved. The point being is that unlike litigation, that is, your collaborative matter is not a matter of the public record. Nobody gets to sit in on your meetings without your consent. So that's very different than a courtroom. And the great news is that even though it's fully private, and even though the negotiations are between you guys and your lawyers, when you reach a final settlement agreement, when you get to that separation agreement, it is no less legally binding than a court order or a separation agreement that you reached at mediation, arbitration. You still have that binding legal agreement. The second thing that collaborative law does, well, most of the time, you're not having to worry about a court schedule, a mediator schedule, an arbitrator schedule. You really just have to think about your schedule, your lawyer's schedule, your spouse's schedule, and their lawyer's schedule. The point being is it tends to, most of the time, take a lot less time than other traditional modes of litigation or other ways even of resolving your matter like arbitration. The third benefit, well, let me say this, ask you this, why not keep your hard-earned resources, your money, your finances for you, for your future, maybe even your spouse's future, and the future of your kids? The thing is that collaborative law tends to be a whole lot less expensive than litigation. What this means is that you're not lining the pockets of your lawyer with legal fees. You're keeping most of that money, or a lot of it, in your own family. Another benefit of collaborative law, well, the thing is that it really tends to save a lot of stress for parties. See, because people who engage in the collaborative law process, well, it's coming from an assumption of people being honest. It's coming from the assumption of people not taking advantage of each other. For example, sometimes lawyers make a calculation mistake, and that's happened, and that happens. Well, in the collaborative law setting, lawyers have to agree not to take advantage of someone else's mistake. If you're in another kind of process, litigation, mediation, and you see that the other lawyer has made a big disaster mistake in terms of the numbers, you have absolutely no duty to point that out. In fact, in the litigation process, it would even be considered by some that if you did point it out, that wouldn't be adequately representing your client. So the thing is that when you are in the collaborative law process and know that everyone's being honest and has each other's back, well, that can reduce the stress a ton. A fourth benefit about the collaborative law process is that you get to make important decisions about your future. Your spouse gets to make important decisions about their future. You get to make important decisions about your kids, your finances, how you divide assets. You can be completely creative in how you reach your resolutions. So you're not handing over these really important decisions to somebody else. You and your spouse, along with the help of your lawyers, are making these decisions together. Another benefit about collaborative law, particularly if you have kids, is that it increases the likelihood of you and your ex-spouse having a reasonable relationship in the future. Well, here's what we know. If you litigate, chances of you being friends, pretty small, right? Well, in collaborative law, even if, I'm not saying smooth sailing the whole time, it might get tense. I mean, people are dealing with, you're dealing with your finances, you're dealing with uncertainty about your future. It can be scary, for sure. However, when you are in that process, working together for the greater good as your family, for your family as a whole, the likelihood of you having a good relationship is much higher. The thing about collaborative law is, well, the way they say it, a good analogy, is like, let's say it's a mediation process, and even though that's way better than litigation, in my opinion, is that still maybe you, your lawyer and you kind of have your cards here, holding them close to your chest a little bit. The other side, they're doing the same thing. Well, the idea about collaborative law is everybody lays all their cards out on the table, and they say, hey, how do we get the best hand for everybody here? The best hand for the entirety of our changing family. Pretty cool, right? Another thing about collaborative law that is really great is that it's future focused. A colleague of mine I have a lot of respect for, she's a mediator. Hi, Rebecca Aileen. She says, focus on the future, not on the fight. The thing is that even in mediation, certainly in litigation, you're often focusing on what happened and why people were wrong and made the terrible mistakes they made or did the wrong things. In collaborative law, what you're doing is you're focusing on the future and saying, okay, that stuff happened. How do we move forward in a way that works for everybody involved? Another thing about the collaborative law, which can be really great, is that it uses a team approach. So, for example, it's often not just the lawyers who are involved. Sometimes they will bring in a parenting coach who's also trained in the collaborative law process. I'm thinking about a case that I had once where we engaged the services of a parenting coach. Now, it was a situation where mom, she was a first-time mom. Dad, first-time dad. Now, Dad had tried very much to work with Mom because he wanted to be able to have a meaningful relationship with their small child. They separated when the child was a baby. Now, because Mom was very stressed about having her young child, very young, be out of her care, she only wanted Dad to see the child during the day for a couple of hours, and then he'd have to bring her back. And for the dad, that was not a long-term solution because he thought, okay, she's a great mom, loves the child, but you know what? I want the opportunity to be a great dad too, and I love my daughter a lot. So rather than the lawyers having his arm wrestle, he should have more time. No, he should have less time. He should have overnights. No, he shouldn't have overnights. It just wasn't going to work. It was kind of like this zero-sum game in the sense like, here's the week, we're dividing it into these certain sections, and one parent's going to win, one's going to lose, or whatever. It wasn't going to work. So we engaged a parenting expert. And that parenting expert, at a fraction of the cost of the lawyers fighting with each other, ended up working with this family and came up with a plan where mom eventually was able to let go of her intense need to make sure the child was safe, and believing that the only time the child was safe was when the child was in her care. Let's blast forward a year, 2 years. These are true co-parents. That child is loved deeply by both mom and dad. Both mom and dad each have an ongoing parental role. They share guardianship, they share parenting time. They have a schedule where that child gets to be showered with love and guidance from both of their parents all the time. And that came through the expertise of a parenting expert. So when you're in the collaborative law process and you work with other collaboratively trained family law professionals, you can actually get really great resources that kind of moves people from a stalemate when they're in one. The other collaborative family law professionals include finance people, like I said, parenting coaches, sometimes even just coaches that help people get through the process themselves as people who are separating. Divorce coaches is what they're called. The other thing that's really great about collaborative law, and I've alluded to this already, is that it tends to be, if people have kids, to be child focused. So rather than focusing on mom's rights or dad's rights, it's like, wow, what is going to work for this child? What is in their best interest? Going back to the stalemate we had with that family with the young child, through the parenting expert, what the mom was able to realize is that it was actually good for her daughter to have that meaningful relationship with the dad. It was good for her daughter's future relationships that mom got along with the dad, but also good for her future relationships that she had a meaningful, strong male role model in her life. Another thing that's really great about collaborative law, a huge benefit, is that it's voluntary. And well, here's the thing. When people end up coming to a process, rolling up their sleeves and saying, yes, let's do this. Let's agree to stay out of the court system and let's get a deal done. Well, when people do that, they are more likely to want to reach resolution, which brings them closer to resolution. And as well, when they reach the resolution, they have a greater likelihood to stick to the agreements that they made. Compare this to a court situation, for example, where a judge comes down with a decision that one party who won thinks is great and the other party thinks is terrible. Well, the person who lost, they might really resist the decision and not cooperate very well. Oh, hey, it's me. Interrupting a little bit because I want videos like this to reach more people. So if you are enjoying what you see, if you're finding it helpful, please hit the subscribe button, which is somewhere up there. And also tell me, what was the biggest takeaway you had with respect to this video? Leave it in the comments below and I will answer every comment, every question, because that's what I do. Now, of course, people are obligated to follow court orders. However, if people actually say, yeah, that's a decision I made for my future and the future of my finances and the future of our children, well, people are going to abide by those decisions a whole lot more often. Let's just say things tend to go much more swimmingly. Now, here's the coolest thing. I think this is the best part about collaborative law. It's the 10th benefit. Remember how I said that lawyers who practice in collaborative law, they have to be specifically trained in collaborative law methods in order to qualify to practice collaborative law, in order to enter into collaborative law agreements? They have to commit to ongoing training. They have to have a lot of training to begin with. They have to connect with their collaborative law colleagues. So the thing is that collaborative law lawyers, well, they just tend to be better lawyers who are able to get you to yes, able to get your matter resolved sooner rather than later, and most of the time for less cost. So there you have it. Those are 10 huge benefits of collaborative family law. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there are some potential downsides that I really want you to know about. Because again, this is your family and your situation, so you want to be able to make the best decision possible. And every family is different. Here's one disadvantage. Because the collaborative law process assumes that people are coming to the table and that they're honest, if there's a scoundrel in the room, if one of the spouses isn't honest, well, what can end up happening is that an unsuspecting spouse could end up being taken advantage of. And unfortunately, I have seen that kind of thing happen. Now, one case I remember is one where the one spouse much underreported their income. So the other spouse, who was entitled to support, ended up settling for much less support than they were entitled to because the other party was dishonest. So if you are thinking about engaging in a collaborative family law process, the thing to think about is, because how people show up for part of their lives is how they show up for all of it. And if you have the kind of spouse who is the kind of person who says, yep, I really took advantage of that situation, I totally screwed them, I got the best deal at the other person's expense, that's not the kind of person that you want to enter into the collaborative law process with. Having said that, if you have the kind of spouse who is the kind of person who says, yeah, you know what, I really want to do what's fair, I really want to do what's right, and you've been with them long enough to know that even when they're in conflict with somebody, they still want to do the right thing, well, chances are that's the kind of person you want to enter into the collaborative law process with. A second potential negative of collaborative family law is that, well, when you enter into that agreement, the collaborative law agreement, the formal agreement, you have disposed of your right to go to court. And if you end up in a stalemate, a standstill, or your spouse decides to be wholly unreasonable, in order to go to court, you have to give them notice and you have to wait before you make the court application a certain amount of days, mostly it's 30, and you have to get rid of your lawyer and hire a new one, and it ends up being a lot. So what's not great about that is that you can end up putting a lot of time, energy, effort into the collaborative law process and then ending up having to go to court and starting all over again. So that is a potential downside. Again, my recommendation, if you are worried about that with your spouse, if you have a spouse, for example, who tends to be really stubborn, who tends to not listen to what other people have to say, who tends to be very positional, they're probably not the kind of person that you're going to want to enter into the collaborative law process with. However, if they are the kind of person who, when they think that something's reasonable, even if it's something they don't necessarily like, they go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. The kind of person who, will compromise, the kind of person who will communicate their concerns, will listen to yours, well, maybe collaborative law is a wonderful choice for your family in that situation. Here's another potential negative that I've seen in collaborative family law. Now, sometimes what happens is someone who has withdrawn from the collaborative law process because they were in a stalemate or they just couldn't get to an agreement, they've come to me and said, hey, I need you to make a court application. Well, here's what can happen sometimes, is that people have spent so much of their resources in the collaborative law process. They've had many, many, many meetings. They've hired the parenting experts. They've got the divorce coaches. You've got the finance person. And they spend all this money in that process that they have no resources left to litigate. So if you are in the collaborative process and you're in a stalemate and you don't feel like you're making progress, well, maybe the thing to think about is pulling the pin on that process before all of your resources are lost, before all of your resources are spent on the collaborative family law professionals, your lawyer, and all of that. And I share that with you because I have seen that happen over the years on numerous occasions. But those are the cases that tend to just go south, right? The point being is that most collaborative family law cases do go really well. People do get to that yes, do get to that agreement without having to start all over again. The very fact that they'd have to start all over again makes people really want to resolve matters. Another potential downside of collaborative family law is, well, sometimes in order to get the deal done, someone has to compromise something that they might not have had to compromise in front of a judge. I'll use the example of spousal support. So in my jurisdiction, we have spousal support advisory guidelines. They are adopted by the courts, and basically when a person makes a certain amount of money and the other spouse makes a lot less amount of money, and you take into account child support and all that kind of stuff, well, sometimes a person has to pay spousal support for a period of time. And a lot of the time, they don't want to do that. Well, in the collaborative process, sometimes what happens in order to get the deal done, the recipient, the potential recipient, might let go of the spousal support they're entitled to just to get the deal done. Whereas if they were in front of a court or an arbitrator, they wouldn't even be able to consider that. They wouldn't even have to do that at all. So sometimes it makes people make a concession that they wouldn't have to make in a court of law. And they do that just to get the deal done. And sometimes that's not fair. A fifth potential downside of using collaborative family law has to do with, well, you know those collaborative family law professionals I was telling you about? Sometimes they're just overused. There are casts of thousands of them, it seems. So for example, sometimes, let's say a parent, they're going through a rough time and they don't appreciate that they are exposing their children to the conflict. They're brokenhearted, they're sad, and they're leaning on their kids or insulting the other parent to their kids, not realizing that will damage their kids. Now, here's what happens. Most parents, when they understand that, we've all heard the horror stories, but most of them go, wow, I didn't know that really hurt them. And no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Going back to, separating, going through a divorce, it's not for the faint of heart, particularly if you have kids. And you've got to put them first. Now, I've been involved in collaborative law cases where one parent is not quite there yet. And they say, okay, you're exposing the child to the conflict, so let's send you off to a parenting coach. Actually, maybe what needs to happen is that the lawyer needs to pull them aside and say, look, do you want your kid to quit school, do drugs? Do you want them to have dysfunctional relationships? Do you want them to hate themselves? Well, then keep it up. Sometimes parties who are in pain themselves just need that strict talking to. So one of the criticisms I have of collaborative family law is sometimes these other professionals are used when it's not necessary. Another one I'm thinking of is sometimes when people have a relatively simple financial situation, they're sent off to a financial advisor. Well, you know what? If they have a mortgage and they've got a pension and they've got some RRSPs, you really don't necessarily need a collaborative family professional who focuses on finance to help you and your client resolve their financial picture. It's pretty easy formula a lot of the time. So that's another critique I have of the process. Another potential downside is that lawyers who practice collaborative family law, a win for those lawyers is that they get to a resolution of the matter, that they get to that final binding separation agreement. Sometimes lawyers are so committed to the process that, and the other side might be very difficult, stubborn, not wanting to reach a reasonable resolution, rather than recommending to their client, you know what, I think we have to down tools. You've got to fire me. You've got to go hire a lawyer who's going to take you to court because your spouse is being totally unreasonable and unfair. Well, sometimes collaborative law lawyers don't want to do that because they see that as a loss for themselves. The point being, as lawyers, we are absolutely 100% obligated all of the time to do what is best for our clients. And sometimes what is best for our clients is saying, you know what, you need to pull out of this process and hire somebody who is going to get you the reasonable settlement that you deserve. I'm not saying you make that decision lightly, but it's something to think about. Finally, the thing about your collaborative family law lawyer is that they have to have specific training in collaborative family law. And not all lawyers have that. And so for some people, if one spouse has a collaborative family law lawyer and the other spouse doesn't, well, you can't enter into the collaborative law process. Having said that, if you are unable to find a collaborative family lawyer who can assist you, well, you can still roll up your sleeves and move forward if you work with a family lawyer who is collaborative, who works collaboratively. And if you have a lawyer who works collaboratively, you want to make sure that they have that dispute resolution training, that value of getting you to the goal. So it all boils down to this. Is collaborative law, collaborative family law, the right fit for you and your family? Only you know the answer to that. However, it is worth exploring, particularly if you have a spouse who is honest, if you have a spouse who values fairness, if you think that you can get through the process reasonably. This is Val. Much, much love.
If you found this video helpful, and I hope you did, please give it a thumbs up. Because if you do that, then this video will be able to reach more people. And as well, if you want to stay in closer touch with me, please ring the little bell icon so that you can subscribe to this channel. This is Val. Much, much love.